Picture this: the Grand Portrait Gallery at Vienna's Hofburg Palace. In 1685, a court painter stands before Empress Margaret Theresa, brush trembling slightly as he studies her face. He's been instructed to paint her truthfully, yet what he sees challenges every principle of royal portraiture. Her lower jaw utes forward so dramatically that her mouth cannot close properly. Teeth protrude at unnatural angles. Drool glistens at the corner of her lips. This is the Habsburg jaw, the physical signature of what happens when royal bloodlines fold back on themselves, generation after generation. The House of Habsburg didn't stumble into genetic catastrophe by accident. They engineered it deliberately across 3 centuries of calculated dynastic marriages. From 1450 to 1750, this family treated their gene pool like a closed experiment, conducting what amounts to history's longest-running study in human inbreeding. The numbers tell a chilling story. Over 80% of Spanish Habsburg marriages occurred between close blood relatives. Uncles married nieces. First cousins married first cousins. In some cases, the same ancestors appeared multiple times in both family lines. Consider the marriage of Philip IV of Spain and his niece Mariana of Austria in 1649. When geneticist Dr. Gonzalo Alvarez analyzed their family trees in 2009, he discovered something horrifying. Tracing back just 4 generations, the same ancestors appeared again and again in both bloodlines. When they produced a son in 1661, Charles II, that child entered the world with an inbreeding coefficient of 0.254. That's higher than what you'd expect from brother-sister incest. Charles never had a chance at a normal life. Contemporary physicians documented an infant who couldn't nurse due to his malformed jaw. He didn't speak until age 4. He couldn't walk until age 8. The French ambassador wrote in 1666, "The Catholic king is so ugly as to cause fear, and he looks ill." His tongue was so enlarged that speech remained nearly unintelligible his entire life. When Charles finally died in November 1700, just before his 39th birthday, the autopsy revealed a body essentially dead for years. A heart the size of a peppercorn, corroded lungs, putrid intestines, a single shriveled testicle. The Habsburgs knew what they were doing. Correspondence in the Vatican archives shows them requesting special dispensations to marry closer relatives than church law allowed, detailing why these marriages were necessary for maintaining power. Not once do they mention their children's welfare. They sacrificed generation after generation to preserve their crown, documenting every horrific result in medical records they tried to hide for centuries. The polished brass calipers gleam in the examination room light. December 1935, Munich. Heinrich Himmler reviews medical files of SS officer candidates with the detached interest of a livestock breeder studying stud records. This is the genesis of Lebensborn, the fountain of life, and what begins as eugenics will metastasize into systematic child kidnapping. The program's literature promised noble goals: financial support for racially pure families, discreet maternity care for unwed mothers, ensuring the next generation exemplified Aryan perfection. But the screening process revealed the sinister machinery beneath. Doctors measured 23 different skull and facial features with precision instruments. They photographed eyes under various lighting to verify color. Genealogists traced family trees back 5 generations, searching for any hint of Jewish, Slavic, or Romani blood. Planning documents from the Federal Archives in Koblenz, marked "for SS leadership only," are shockingly frank. They use the word Züchtung breeding. The SS are described as Zuchtstämme, breeding stock. There are charts showing how many generations of selective breeding would increase frequencies of desired traits. Most chilling, calculations for acceptable levels of genetic abnormality. They knew intensive breeding would increase genetic disorders. A handwritten note in Himmler's own hand reads, "Acceptable losses in pursuit of racial perfection." The program radicalized when war came. As German forces occupied Poland in 1939, SS anthropologists followed, hunting for children. Blonde hair, blue eyes, certain facial structures, these became criteria for kidnapping. Aloisa Stankiewicz was 7 when SS officers burst into her Czech village in June 1942. They measured her head with calipers, checked her hair against a color chart, and tore her from her screaming mother's arms. She was taken to a facility in Poznan where kidnapped children underwent forced re-education. Speaking Polish, earned beatings with leather straps. Crying for her mother meant hours locked in dark cellars. After 6 weeks, she was renamed Ingrid Schmidt and placed with an SS family in Bavaria. For 3 years, she forgot her real name, her language, her mother's face. When the Red Cross reunited them in 1946, 10-year-old Ingrid didn't recognize the woman claiming to be her mother. Between 20,000 and 200,000 children were kidnapped, the uncertainty revealing how successfully the SS destroyed evidence. Surviving medical records show genetic disorder rates at Lebensborn homes significantly higher than the general population. They got more blonde-haired children. They also got more hemophilia, clubfoot, and developmental delays. The selective breeding experiment worked in one sense. It created exactly the genetic catastrophe they'd calculated as acceptable losses. The cattle car doors slam shut with terrible finality. May 1944, Auschwitz-Birkenau. Dr. Josef Mengele stands on the selection ramp in his immaculate SS uniform as Hungarian Jews stagger from trains after days without food or water. He's not watching the elderly being directed toward gas chambers. He's searching for matching faces. When he spots 10-year-old Eva Kor and her twin sister Miriam, he actually smiles. Mengele arrived at Auschwitz in May 1943 with impeccable credentials. A PhD in anthropology from Munich, an MD from Frankfurt, training under Ottmar von Verschuer at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. Verschuer was obsessed with twin studies as the key to unlocking genetic secrets. At the institute, suitable subjects were scarce. At Auschwitz, Mengele had unlimited human research material. Correspondence between Mengele and Verschuer, declassified in 1992, is written in mundane scientific language. Mengele writes about shipping specimens, eyes, organs, blood samples from twins. Verschuer responds with protocol suggestions. In June 1944, Mengele excitedly describes how 440,000 Hungarian Jews, arriving in 8 weeks, gave him unprecedented opportunity for twin studies on a scale never before possible. He wasn't opportunistically studying twins who happened to be there. He actively selected them from masses arriving specifically for experimentation. Eva Kor described how Mengele examined them on the ramp and shouted "Swillinga!" twins with unmistakable excitement. She and Miriam were taken to special barracks housing about 200 twin sets, mostly children. Conditions were marginally better than the rest of camp. They kept their hair, got slightly more food, weren't immediately gassed. But this wasn't mercy. The experiments were methodical. 3 times weekly, twins went to Mengele's laboratory. Dr. Miklos Niesli, a pathologist forced to assist Mengele, documented the protocol. Extensive measurements, blood draws so heavy children fainted, then experimental interventions. Vera Kriegel testified about spinal injections of unknown substances at age 5. The pain made her back arch involuntarily. She screamed until her voice gave out. Mengele checked her eyes against color charts. She believes he was trying to change them from brown to blue. Multiple survivors described seeing jars of preserved eyes in Mengele's laboratory, different colors arranged like insect specimens. SS guard Hans Munch confirmed this at the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials. In 1964, testifying, Mengele spoke about his eye collection proudly. Niesli testified about performing autopsies on 14 twins killed simultaneously by chloroform injections to the heart. Mengele wanted comparative data with bodies in identical decomposition states. Of approximately 1,000 twin pairs experimented on, only 200 pairs survived. The mortality rate was 80%. Mengele escaped to South America, died in Brazil in 1979, never faced trial. Eva Kor's sister, Miriam, died in 1993 from cancer doctors linked to the experiments. The wind howls across frozen Manchurian plains. February 1940, outside Harbin, China. A Chinese prisoner is dragged from his cell into sub-zero darkness, arms bared to elements. Japanese researchers in heavy coats watch impassively as frost forms on his skin. This is Unit 731, where what happened makes Mengele look restrained. General Shiro Ishii established Unit 731 in 1936 with Emperor Hirohito's explicit approval. The mandate: develop biological weapons through human experimentation. The compound housed up to 600 prisoners called Maruta logs. This dehumanizing terminology was deliberate. It psychologically enabled procedures otherwise unthinkable. The frozen prisoner outside participates in frostbite research. Researchers expose his arms until tissue freezes solid, judged by striking the limb with a stick. Frozen flesh produces a distinctive hollow thud. Yoshio Shinozuka, a former unit member who confessed in 1997, described the next phase: frozen prisoners brought inside, subjected to different rewarming methods: hot water immersion, heated air exposure, natural thawing, while researchers documented tissue damage and gangrene development. The screaming when frozen nerves regained sensation was like nothing human. Frostbite was one research area among dozens. The vivisection wing dissected living subjects without anesthesia. Facility procedures documented in Russian archives state anesthesia would alter physiological state and contaminate data. Prisoners infected with plague, anthrax, or cholera were vivisected at infection stages to observe disease progression in living tissue. Shinozuka testified about vivisecting a pregnant Chinese woman in her third trimester. She'd been infected with syphilis for vertical transmission research. When infection reached a certain stage, she was brought to the vivisection room, conscious and restrained. Shinozuka described cutting her open, alive, removing organs one by one, then dissecting the fetus. She died on the table. Her body was incinerated. No record of her name survives. Pressure experiments tested atmospheric tolerance. Prisoners, sealed in chambers where pressure was manipulated, experienced eyes bulging from sockets, then rupturing at high pressure. At low pressure, intestines protruded through the rectum as internal gases expanded. Each stage was carefully documented. Beyond laboratory work, Unit 731 weaponized their research. In October 1940, Ishii ordered plague-infected fleas dropped on Ningbo, China. The attack killed approximately 500 immediately, with secondary transmission causing extensive casualties for weeks. Similar attacks followed using cholera and typhoid. Total deaths exceeded 200,000. After Japan's surrender, General Douglas MacArthur granted Ishii immunity in exchange for his data. Ishii never faced trial, died peacefully. In 1959, the data America acquired was eventually classified as worthless, poorly controlled experiments contaminated by sadism. The waiting room at Tuskegee Institute is crowded with nervous men. November 1932, Macon County, Alabama. Sharecroppers and laborers sit fidgeting, summoned by official letters from the United States Public Health Service. They've been told they have bad blood, and the government is offering free treatment. What they don't know is that treatment is precisely what they'll never receive. The Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male was designed from inception to observe syphilis progression from infection to death without therapeutic intervention. 600 African American men enrolled, 399 with latent syphilis, 201 without the disease as controls. None were told they had syphilis. Doctors informed them they suffered from bad blood, a local term for various ailments. Dr. Raymond Fonderlehr, the study's director, justified deception in internal correspondence. A memo from April 1933 at the National Archives states, "These subjects constitute a group of syphilitic Negroes who are not receiving treatment. We plan to continue observation of this untreated group indefinitely." Notice the language, indefinitely. From the beginning, there was no plan to ever treat these men. The study's sinister nature became clearer when penicillin proved effective for syphilis in 1947. Ethical researchers would have immediately offered treatment. Instead, Tuskegee researchers actively prevented participants from receiving penicillin. They instructed local physicians not to treat study subjects. They wrote to draft boards during World War II requesting participant deferments to prevent military medical examinations that would reveal syphilis and lead to treatment. Charlie Pollard enrolled in 1932 at age 29. For 40 years, he attended checkups where doctors performed spinal taps, extremely painful procedures, extracting cerebrospinal fluid. Doctors called this special free treatment for bad blood. In reality, it was purely diagnostic, documenting how syphilis invaded his central nervous system. His medical records show progressive cardiovascular damage, neurological deterioration, eventually neurosyphilis. All preventable with penicillin. All deliberately allowed for documentation purposes. By the study's end in 1972, 28 men died directly from syphilis, 100 from complications. 40 wives were infected through sexual contact, 19 children born with congenital syphilis. These weren't accidental deaths. They were foreseeable, intended outcomes of withholding treatment. The study only ended when Peter Buxton, a public health service investigator, contacted Associated Press reporter Gene Heller in 1972 after his superiors dismissed his concerns twice. Public outrage forced termination. No criminal charges were ever filed. Dr. John Heller, study director from 1943 to 48, told Congress the men's status did not warrant ethical debate. They were subjects, not patients. Clinical material, not sick people. The safe house smells of stale cigarettes and cheap perfume. San Francisco, 1955. A man visiting a prostitute accepts a drink, not noticing the bitter taste. Within 30 minutes, walls breathe, colors bleed into impossible spectra, terror rises as reality disintegrates. Behind a two-way mirror, CIA operative George Hunter White watches, drinks a martini, takes notes. Welcome to Operation Midnight Climax. This was one tentacle of Project MKUltra, the CIA's mind control program operating from 1953 to 73 across 80 institutions. The CIA wanted to develop interrogation techniques, explore whether LSD could create programmable assassins, extract confessions, erase memories. They experimented on anyone: prisoners, mental patients, hospital patients, random civilians who had no idea they were being drugged. In Kentucky, a mental patient known as Patient A in declassified documents received LSD every day for 174 consecutive days. Nearly 6 months of continuous psychedelic experience without baseline consciousness. Researchers documented progressive deterioration, persistent hallucinations during confirmed non-administration periods, paranoid ideation, eventual psychotic break. Dr. Harris Isbell at the Addiction Research Center in Lexington received $43,000 from the CIA from 1955 to 63 for drug experiments. He preferred African American subjects, incentivizing them with heroin to participate in LSD trials. Some received massive doses, 1,400 micrograms, and were left alone in isolation chambers to experience whatever psychological horrors emerged. At Montreal's Allen Memorial Institute, Dr. Donald Evan Cameron conducted psychic driving experiments funded by $69,000 CIA dollars. From 1957 to 64, Cameron believed he could erase memories and rebuild personalities. His methods were medieval, drug-induced comas lasting weeks, electroconvulsive therapy at 30 to 40 times normal power, administered multiple times daily, isolation chambers with paralytic drugs while degrading recorded messages played 16 hours daily. Linda McDonald entered in January 1963 seeking postpartum depression treatment. Cameron diagnosed her with acute schizophrenia. She received 102 electroshock treatments over 6 months, plus extended comas and psychic driving. When released, her memory was completely erased. She didn't recognize her husband or remember her 3 children. She'd forgotten how to read, write, cook, perform basic self-care. Her husband had to reteach her everything about a life she couldn't remember living. In 1973, director Richard Helms ordered all MKUltra files destroyed. Most were incinerated. What we know comes from financial records that survived, testimony from victims and perpetrators who came forward, and about 20,000 documents that escaped destruction by bureaucratic accident. No criminal charges were filed. Researchers like Cameron and Isbell were already dead when investigations began. Surviving researchers faced no legal consequences. The hospital ward reeks of decay and antiseptic. Guatemala City, June 1947. A woman known only as Berta lies in bed at the National Mental Hospital, scratching sores erupting across her arms and genitals. She doesn't understand what's happening. She can't. She's a psychiatric patient with limited comprehension who's been deliberately infected with syphilis, then gonorrhea, then both, simultaneously by American researchers viewing her as experimental material. The Guatemala syphilis experiments ran from 1946 to 48, conducted by Dr. John Charles Cutler of the United States Public Health Service with National Institutes of Health funding. Cutler had worked on Tuskegee and wanted to test whether prophylactic treatments could prevent syphilis infection. Unlike Tuskegee's observation of existing infections, Guatemala required creating new ones. 1,300 people were deliberately infected: soldiers, prisoners, sex workers, orphans, psychiatric patients, children. Initial methods involved paying female sex workers with syphilis to have unprotected sex with male prisoners who didn't know the women were diseased. When this didn't achieve high enough infection rates, some immune systems resisted. Cutler turned to direct inoculation. Experimental protocols from February 1947 describe the procedure with clinical detachment. The subject's penis or vaginal area is abraded using a sterile curette to remove the epithelial layer. Infectious material obtained from active syphilitic lesions is then applied directly to the abraded area. Translation: they scraped away skin from people's genitals, then poured syphilis-infected pus into the wounds. The pain would have been excruciating. Berta's medical file tells a story of systematic escalation. Infected with syphilis in February 1947, when she showed immune resistance, she was infected with gonorrhea in March. When she still didn't develop sufficient symptoms, researchers cut open her forearms and introduced infected material in June. By July, she had open sores covering her body. She died in August. The autopsy attributed death to systemic infection with multiple organ involvement. Of 1,300 infected, only 700 received any treatment, often intentionally incomplete. Cutler wanted to test prophylactics and early interventions, not provide optimal care. By 1953, 83 people had died. The experiments enjoyed full institutional support. The Guatemalan government provided access to prisons, military barracks, mental hospitals, orphanages. Multiple ministries knew and approved. This wasn't a rogue doctor, it was an official, bilateral research program. Records were filed away and classified. Cutler became a respected professor at the University of Pittsburgh, teaching medical ethics among other subjects, dying in 2003 without facing consequences. The experiments only came to light when Professor Susan Reverby discovered documents in 2010 while researching Tuskegee. President Obama apologized in 2010. Survivors filed lawsuits. A federal judge dismissed cases in 2012, ruling the United States cannot be held liable for actions in foreign countries. Willowbrook State School on Staten Island is overcrowded and filthy. October 1956. Parents desperate to secure admission for their intellectually disabled children receive letters from Dr. Saul Krugman offering faster enrollment in a special hepatitis research unit. The letters describe participation as contributing to important medical research while receiving excellent care. What they don't clearly explain is that children will be deliberately infected with hepatitis. Willowbrook housed intellectually disabled children in deplorable conditions, overcrowding, inadequate sanitation, rampant disease. Hepatitis was endemic, with infection rates approaching 100% within the first year. Krugman saw this as research opportunity. If children would get hepatitis anyway, why not infect them deliberately under controlled conditions to study disease progression and test potential vaccines? Consent forms used carefully deceptive language. One from 1962 reads, "We are conducting a study of hepatitis and would like to include your child. The study involves vaccinating children against hepatitis and following their progress." The word vaccinating suggests protection. What Krugman actually did was feed children hepatitis-contaminated stool samples. The experimental protocol was methodical. Newly admitted children in the research unit were divided into groups. Some received oral doses of hepatitis-contaminated fecal material mixed into food. Others received injections of virus-contaminated blood serum from infected children. Control groups received neither. Then researchers waited, documenting incubation periods, symptom progression, liver enzyme levels, illness duration. When children became sick, which they all did, unless they had pre-existing immunity, they received minimal treatment. The goal was observing natural disease progression. Children developed jaundice, intense nausea and vomiting, liver swelling and pain. Some developed fulminant hepatitis, where the liver fails catastrophically. Several died. The experiments continued from 1956 to 71. Hundreds of children were deliberately infected. Krugman published multiple papers, becoming a recognized hepatitis expert. His work contributed to hepatitis B vaccine development, genuinely important medical advance. But the achievement came through using cognitively disabled children as experimental subjects without meaningful consent. When bioethicist Henry Beecher published his famous 1966 paper identifying unethical research, he included Willowbrook. Criticism intensified. Krugman defended his work, arguing children would have been exposed anyway due to Willowbrook's conditions. So deliberate infection under controlled circumstances, advanced science without substantially increasing risk. Maurice Hilleman, legendary vaccine developer, later called Willowbrook the most unethical medical experiments ever performed on children in the United States. Krugman never faced sanctions. He continued his career at NYU, received numerous awards, served as American Pediatric Society president, died in 1995, respected by his profession. The cell door clangs open in D Block at Holmesburg Prison, Philadelphia. June 1951. Dr. Albert Kligman enters, surveying the inmates. According to his own account recorded in later interviews, his first thought was, "All I saw before me were acres of skin." It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time. That phrase, acres of skin, perfectly captures Kligman's mindset. He saw prisoners not as human beings, but as experimental terrain to be exploited. For 23 years, from 1951 to 74, Kligman conducted approximately 150 studies on Holmesburg inmates. Experiments ranged from cosmetics testing to exposure to chemical weapons, radioactive isotopes, and dioxin. The dioxin experiments are particularly well documented because they resulted in lawsuits. Edward Anthony, prisoner number 41758, volunteered for a dioxin study in 1964. He was told it involved testing acne medication. What he wasn't told was the medication was concentrated dioxin, an Agent Orange component, at levels far exceeding therapeutic uses. Researchers applied dioxin directly to Anthony's back. Within weeks, severe chloracne erupted, painful cystic lesions that wouldn't heal. 60 years later, when interviewed in 2015, Anthony lifted his shirt showing scarred back. The chloracne lesions never fully healed. He developed liver problems, immune dysfunction, diabetes linked to dioxin exposure. Anthony tried to sue in 2000 seeking compensation for lifelong health effects. The court dismissed his case because the statute of limitations had expired. The judge ruled that even though Anthony couldn't have known the full extent of injuries until decades later, the clock started when the experiment was conducted. Kligman died wealthy in 2010. Anthony lives on disability, his body permanently damaged. Beyond dioxin, inmates were infected with herpes simplex, exposed to fungal infections, injected with viral pathogens, exposed to asbestos. Some studies were CIA-funded MKUltra projects. Kligman received payments for administering massive LSD doses to prisoners and documenting psychological reactions. While conducting these experiments, Kligman also developed Retin-A, the tretinoin-based acne treatment, becoming one of the pharmaceutical industry's most profitable products. He earned millions in royalties. The prisoners whose skin he exploited received their initial payment of $10 to $300 and nothing more. When former inmates filed class action lawsuits seeking Retin-A profit shares, arguing they were involuntary research subjects whose participation led to the discovery, courts ruled against them. Statute of limitations had expired. Kligman kept his fortune. These practices only ended because journalists exposed them and public outrage forced reforms. The 1974 National Research Act didn't emerge from medical community or ethical enlightenment. It was political response to scandal. The isolation chamber is completely dark and soundproofed. Montreal, March 1963. Linda MacDonald lies immobilized by paralytic drugs, unable to move anything except her eyes. Through headphones clamped to her head, a recorded message plays on endless loop in her own voice. You are a bad mother. You are worthless. You caused your own problems. The message has been playing for 16 hours. It will play for 16 more tomorrow, and the day after. And the day after, Linda entered the Allen Memorial Institute in January 1963, seeking help for postpartum depression following the birth of her third child. She was 25 years old, married, by all accounts a loving mother, struggling with what we now recognize as a treatable condition. Dr. Donald Evan Cameron diagnosed her with acute schizophrenia and prescribed experimental treatment that would destroy her mind. Cameron was one of the most prominent psychiatrists of his era. He'd been president of the American Psychiatric Association, the Canadian Psychiatric Association, and the World Psychiatric Association. He'd served on the Nuremberg Medical Tribunal that prosecuted Nazi doctors, and from 1957 to 64, he was conducting experiments at the Allen Memorial Institute, funded by $69,000 from the CIA through a front organization as part of MKUltra. Cameron believed he could erase existing memories and rebuild personalities from scratch through a process he called psychic driving. The theory was that by breaking down a patient's existing personality completely, he could reconstruct a healthier one. The reality was systematic psychological torture that left patients with permanent brain damage. Linda's treatment followed Cameron's standard protocol. First came depatterning, the erasure phase. She was placed in a drug-induced coma using barbiturates and other sedatives. While comatose, she received electroconvulsive therapy shock treatment at 30 to 40 times normal power. The shocks were administered multiple times daily. In total, over 6 months, Linda received 102 electroshock treatments. Between shock sessions, she remained in the drug-induced coma, sometimes for weeks at a time. When she briefly regained consciousness, she was placed in the isolation chamber for psychic driving. Paralyzed by drugs like curare, yes, the same poison used on arrows, she was forced to listen to recorded messages through headphones 16 hours per day. The messages were crafted to be maximally degrading. Sometimes they were generic condemnations. You are worthless. You are a failure. Sometimes they were specific to the patient's fears and insecurities, extracted from therapy sessions. Most disturbing, Cameron would record patients' voices during therapy, then edit the recordings to create loops of self-condemnation. Imagine hearing yourself tell yourself, in your own voice, that you're a terrible mother, over and over, for 16 hours straight. While paralyzed and unable to escape, Cameron kept meticulous notes on his patient's deterioration. After one of Linda's final shock sessions, he wrote, "Complete depatterning achieved. Subject demonstrates no recall of previous identity, family relationships, or life history. Reconstruction can now begin." But reconstruction never worked. When Linda was finally released, she had no memory of her life. She didn't recognize her husband. She had no recollection of her 3 children or of giving birth to them. She couldn't remember how to read, write, or cook. She'd forgotten basic self-care tasks. Her husband had to reteach her everything, showing her photographs and telling her stories about a life she couldn't remember living. Linda's medical records, obtained through litigation her family filed against the Canadian government, document the systematic destruction of her mind. Progress notes clinically describe how her memory, personality, and cognitive function were systematically erased. There's no indication Cameron or his staff ever questioned whether what they were doing was ethical. The CIA knew what Cameron was doing. Progress reports he submitted to his handlers, they survived because they were filed separately from main MKUltra records destroyed in 1973, describe his depatterning technique, noting success rates for memory erasure and side effects including permanent cognitive damage. The CIA continued funding anyway, because they hoped his techniques might prove useful for interrogation. When MKUltra was exposed in the mid-70s, through the Church Committee hearings, Cameron was already dead, having died in 1967. He never faced consequences. The Canadian government eventually settled with survivors, paying 100,000 Canadian dollars per victim. But no amount could restore Linda's stolen memories. Linda McDonald lived for 40 more years after her treatment, dying in 2003. She spent those decades with massive gaps in her identity, permanent cognitive impairment, and the trauma of knowing that somewhere in her erased past were children she'd given birth to but couldn't remember loving. Her husband stayed with her, patiently helping her navigate a world where everyone else remembered a life she'd been forced to forget. At Cameron's funeral in 1967, colleagues eulogized him as a pioneering psychiatrist who advanced the field. There was no mention of the minds he'd destroyed. These 10 cases span 3 centuries and multiple continents. Yet they share a disturbing architecture revealing how atrocities become possible. In each, people were first categorized into those worthy of protection and those available for exploitation. The Habsburgs sacrificed children to dynastic power. The Nazis bred and kidnapped for racial purity. Mengele selected twins like laboratory specimens. Unit 731 called prisoners logs to enable vivisection. Tuskegee called participants subjects to justify withholding treatment. MKUltra drugged thousands without consent. Guatemala infected psychiatric patients. Willowbrook infected disabled children. Habsburg saw acres of skin. Cameron erased minds for CIA research. The pattern is always dehumanization preceding atrocity. These weren't isolated monsters, but systematic programs at prestigious institutions with governmental funding. The only defense is remembering, ensuring every generation understands that progress without ethics doesn't lead to enlightenment, but to evil in white coats.